So one of the reasons that Einstein was so brilliant was because the scientists of the day were trying to explain how light traveled and the speed at which it traveled. And imagine this ether that was this invisible substance that carried light through, kind of like sound waves. They wondered if light traveled in the same way, through a medium of this stuff called ether. Now, the problem with this is that all the experiments that they were able to concoct could not conclusively prove the existence of this ether. And so Einstein steps in and says, what if there was no ether? He throws out the previous mindset and says, what if light travels at a constant speed, speed c? And the reason this is revolutionary is because of what we notice as a result of frames of reference. So let's say we have, this is a spaceship, a rather crude drawing, with a laser at the top that shines down here. All right? So laser shines down from here. If you're in the spaceship, this is what you see. If you're outside of the spaceship, this is what you see. Instead, it looks something like that, because you're out here. So what he's saying, basically, is that if speed is c, and c remains constant, well, distance over time equals speed. So if this is constant, then one of these has to be changing. That's what Einstein is saying. So as we discuss how to read the Bible, I thought it would be a good place to start to look at some of the contextual issues that are present in every aspect of Christian scripture. The reason that I say that, present in every aspect, and the reason that I've titled this, Are You a Jew?, is because almost all, if not all, of the authors of the Old and New Testament were Jewish writers. And that means that they bring to the scriptures very key and very well defined worldviews and assumptions as they write that are very, very different in a Jewish Near Eastern context than what we bring to it when we read those texts with a Western viewpoint. All right? So we have certain tendencies that when we read a text are unfair to the author. For instance, in Western culture, we really like to say, is it this or this? We set up these dichotomous relationships where it's one or the other. The interesting thing is that the Jewish language actually didn't even have a conjunction for either or. It was almost always both and is the way it was represented. So we would say, well, I look at Scripture, is it man's free will or God's divine sovereignty? That's a false dichotomy. It's both and. The Jews saw it as both and. That's why it's never explained in Scripture how it can be both and, because they didn't need to. They just assumed. That was an assumption they brought to their text. Another aspect that's pretty huge is that to a Jew, there's no distinction between a secular realm and a sacred realm. This is something, again, that we as Platonic influenced Western people, we bring to our lives, to the Scriptures. We say that there is the sacred things, prayer, and even vocationally, the priesthood. Not so in Scripture. For a Jew, a priest was every bit as much a valid profession as a shepherd. Biblically, that is the case. That is how the authors wrote. Now, there's also the concept of meta-narrative. Now, what does that mean? That means that every book serves a purpose. So from Genesis to Malachi in the Old Testament, but if you're a Christian, from Genesis all the way up to Revelation, the story is going somewhere. And that it is an overarching story. That means that what happened in Genesis affects what happens in the book of Ruth. And what happens in the book of Ruth affects what happens in Malachi. What happens in Malachi affects what happens in Galatians and on forward. So there's an overarching story. Now the last is the Jewish sentiment of community versus the individual. Now in a Western culture, the individual is king. What I want, what I feel, what I think, king. As opposed to a Jewish Near Eastern, it's very different. Now let's talk about in Eastern. The individual gets lost altogether. It's just the community is the way that things are thought about. Now, in a Jewish Near Eastern, again, it's both and. The community is highly focused, but the individual has worth, and they're interplaying. So we'll see these things over and over again as we look at specific places in Scripture, as you all have asked to see certain things looked at. We'll look at those, but we need to have these as a backdrop. And the reason that I did this beginning video that you saw at the beginning there is because even if you don't intuitively understand it, doesn't mean it's not true. You see, these things, that's the way they're written. That's the way that we're expected to read them. But just because we don't, because it's not natural for us to think that way, doesn't mean that's not the way it should be. Does that make sense? So yeah, if you want to dialogue more about what those things mean, how they play out into Scripture, we can talk about that. But yeah, just know that as we read these things, we need to readjust our mindsets to fit those of the original audience.